Pettitt here, and we are entering section 2, which is called the Common Defense. First chapter, chapter 4, is the Department of Defense, and my friend Colleen is stupid enough to have a conversation with me after having read this poorly written chapter about something that's relatively important to the future of the country. Here we go! Colleen, thank you for being here. Just out of curiosity, do you have any starting place that you would like to kick us off with?
Well, yes. I mean, the document reads as a policy outline, so what they anticipate the policy of the US to be. And so trying to align the spending for the Department of Defense with what they feel the policy emphasis should be. And it appears that our biggest policy emphasis is almost deterrence through strength, which is a former US policy that we've used before. But it it really steers the US actually back to some defense initiatives that have kind of taken a back burner in past years, like nuclear. Um,
Nuclear's back.
there's a huge emphasis on nuclear and building a nuclear arsenal and keeping up with an arms race almost, except this time it's with China. And I think one of the things with that is that Chinese, I don't know, emphasis hasn't really been on them being a nuclear threat to us. I mean, there's so many other aspects. One thing right away though, so nuclear makes a comeback, and there's a lot of stuff that says that nuclear deterrence isn't really a real thing. Like it's not something that is functional, and it becomes that spending battle back and forth like we did with Russia. Um, Another huge thing though, and this is just I taught human geography for a very long time. We keep talking about Taiwan. Taiwan is not a country. Taiwan belongs to China. Like it's not a separate entity. Like it has its own governance and political structure, but there's a huge emphasis on Taiwan. And the moment that we become involved in Taiwan, we're triggering ourselves for a full scale war because
Right.
Taiwan is Chinese land. Like Taiwan is owned by China. They have their own sovereignty over it. And so that was actually the biggest thing immediately that I saw was, hey, we need to, and actually that's the biggest emphasis at the start of the whole document is it's not even that China's a threat, it's Taiwan. We have to go and protect Taiwan so it's not taken over by China. But again,
Mhm.
China owns
Danger,
Taiwan.
danger, danger, danger. Yeah, full disclosure, just to share what an idiot I am. Um, I taught intercultural communications a couple of semesters, and the textbook that was given to me for the class, I certainly did not pick the textbook. I'm not responsible for it, but it talked about, the stereotypical thing, like this is the one thing you need to know about going to this country. This is the one thing you need to know about going to this country. I hated this textbook. Anyway, so it had something in there about Taiwan, and I had Chinese international students in my class, and they were like totally confused. Why is this being listed as a country? And my stupid Texas public education ass was like, I don't know, because it's a country. And they were like, no, it's not. And I was, what? I don't understand what's happening right now. And my brain is like, right? Like, do they have their own Olympic team? Like, that's what qualifies somebody as a country. I had no idea what I was talking about. Went on a rabbit hole, apologized to them, and here we are. But we don't know. We don't even know like our own location to where. What is the closest nuclear reactor to where we are currently situated? Most people can't answer that question. So, like, surprise, we don't know this either. And the international policy is supposed to be so, quote, loyal to the president's agenda, that the president's agenda is also not sophisticated enough to be reality based.
Mm-mm.
Specifically, when you're inserting nuclear weapons, etc., this seems like maybe get something right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean it's a provocation. It's again, it's not an official government document, but I mean it's focused on China and it's that provocation with it. And yeah, actually, what you're talking about is a lot of the military techniques in here do seem very outdated in the capacity of you're looking to build up an arsenal of, physical response where that isn't our biggest threat, especially since we're fairly isolated for the most part. Our bigger threats are cyber related and infrastructure in general, or terrorism. I mean, when Russia went after the Ukraine, I guess for me as a history teacher, I was like, wow, I never thought we'd see like a good old fashioned war. And I know that's a mischaracterization, like it's not the correct way to say it, but from a historical perspective, I never thought we'd see just another country walking over and invading a neighbor. And
Just deciding I want this land.
yeah, and that's very kind of outdated in a lot of ways. And so outside of that, I mean, Russia has those expenditures though, like it has its, physical warheads from the past. And I don't know, it doesn't seem like when I've looked at US concerns or strategic concerns, big parts of it don't come back to, oh, we need nuclear warheads. It's our infrastructure is at risk. Like there's the cyber risk that is so much more overwhelming than nuclear warfare. And keep in mind though that if we create a nuclear arsenal, we then put ourselves at a cyber risk depending on how it's secured and how it's run. There was an incident, I think it was Iran, where even one of their nuclear centers, they were able to download a bug, an opposing force, and what it did is it basically caused the accelerators to go slightly fast. So it increased the breakage rate of a certain product by like 20%, which they didn't realize for a while because it was messing up. But then you come to find out it was actually espionage that was kind of done subversively that way. But yeah.
What it's I think what you're hitting on that I think is overall very important, especially in an area that I have paid zero attention to, is what is outdated mixing with what is very much real, mixing with what is very much the future. So like there's kind of a dusty archive feeling. And even if that's going back to like the Cold War nuclear focus, what you're talking about is like grid warfare. We're talking about drones, things like this. And in other chapters, it's talking about how we're using trade or treaty agreements or debt as a form of warfare. It's so much more sophisticated and complicated than, to use your point, walking across a human-made border and deciding I want this, either from a colonization place, an expansion place, just power hungry in this case. Uh, it's a little illuminating, I guess, that I would have assumed that the Project 2025 mandate for leadership, whatever, would be far more rooted in what the departments are actually doing, like what they're actually about in the world. And because it's not, they really read like gossip columns. Um, when now that Trump has been in office for at least a week, I think, a little bit over a week, seems like longer than that already. The executive orders were likely written by these authors or the same sources that wrote these different chapters. Being able to pick like Hegseth or whoever for any of the other departments, like I deeply believe that the people who were involved with the Heritage Foundation documentation of this version of Mandate of Leadership, it started in 1979, were involved in all the executive orders and the prioritization of when those orders are coming out and rolling out, because I don't think they feel like they have a ton of time. But it's wildly not connected to any of the other pieces that are happening in the world, let alone like how it would get approved or something.
Well, it's
Um,
not even that. It's a big part of this is designed to support manufacturing in the United States. And another part of it is about reindustrializing the US so that we could be self-sufficient in these areas, which you want an increase in the number of warheads and planes and especially ships. My father worked in the shipyard industry in the US, so I lived through it dying. We don't have the capacity in the US to build this many ships. I mean, we have Newport News in Virginia for the aircraft carriers. They're tied up for because of their long-term contracts. But even outside of that, you want to create industrialization in the US. There's a mention in here, though, about how there'll be strategic partnerships so that these industries aren't reliant on the Department of Defense to stay in business. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not feasible. Like, it contradicts capitalism to some extent because we no longer can produce things at this level. Like, we can't afford it or it'll be exponentially more expensive. So it's unrealistic to say, hey, we're going to open a ton of steel yards, we're going to open a ton of shipyards and be able to keep our costs down or even find the workers for it. I mean, in the 90s and 80s, my father struggled staffing shipyards because trying to find people who were willing to be welders. And immigration services, whenever they came to the shipyard, it delayed their project by 2 months. And so there is that domino with it that you basically have, in some ways, there's a lot of stuff that isn't concrete. It's saying, here's our policy directive, let's go after China. They're bad. It makes minimal
Mm-hmm.
mention of Russia.
Mm-hmm.
It only alludes to the Ukrainian aspect of Russia. But then it's also kind of trying to say, hey, we need to onshore these things and we'll ramp up this production. Well, I don't disagree with that. Like, we need to do something to secure up our supply chain in general because we do have a lot of vulnerabilities in that area. But because we don't rely as much on manufacturing in the US, it's hard to build these huge industries that wouldn't be Department of Defense based. And that's why, I mean, that's why we don't have a competing airline in the US. Like, Boeing's it because of how much goes into up ramping production of these things. And so it's unrealistic. And in the past, when the US would produce at these levels during wartime, it's because we were a manufacturing country and the industries could switch over production to allow for this. We don't have
Mm-hmm.
a skilled labor force to be able to do this. Um, and we wouldn't be able to have the cost benefit of doing it now because we'd have to re-onshore all these things. And we're not set
Yeah,
up for that.
I mean, obviously, what you're saying is spot on, and their kind of like Christmas music that's just playing over and over again is that the free market economy will fix it. The free market economy will fix it. But if you don't have the employees or the talent or the skill, you also do not have uniform regulations or expectations or inspections of the things that these people that we don't have or would actually be building or creating. It doesn't make any sense. And I think not only is it bad for like democracy or bad for like the world, I think it's really bad business to say like, oh, the market will work it out. Um, this is
Well, it
really
did.
important.
The market already did work it out. It outsourced it. So, like, you're trying now to actually move the market irregularly because you're trying to onshore stuff again. And so, no, the market went to the cheap labor and to the
Right,
places where we could minimize production.
right. No, you're totally right. All right, so in this section, what is going to be touched upon theme wise, and then we're going to get directly to what's in this chapter for Department of Defense. Whew. Okay. They're very upset about vaccine mandates. So, this is the chapter where people are supposed to be able to be allowed to come back into work or back into the military service who didn't want a vaccine, and they're supposed to get back pay. That's one. An equity agenda. How it's using this word. It also is requesting the Department of Justice recommit to non-discrimination, which sounds like, oh, okay. No, what they mean is by naming racism, by naming diversity, equity, inclusion kind of programs or rules or inequitable opportunities or things like this, that you are actually being racist. So the recommitment to an equity agenda is treating all people equal because all lives matter, everybody is the same. It's all about opportunity. And by highlighting who supposedly has less of an opportunity, you're then invading the opportunity that the other groups have.
Wait, is
That's
that in this? Did you find that in this chapter? Or is
not a
that
chapter. That's a theme through the whole thing.
okay?
Yeah. Sorry, don't mean to alarm you. I promise you read the right chapter.
I was like,
Okay. um, that the overall theme is to be entirely risk adverse, which is also interesting if there's an emphasis on the free market economy because entrepreneurial risk is that's that's your choice of going into business. If you don't like it, move or quit or something like that. Same thing with shareholders. There's a risk involved in focusing in shareholders for return on investment. However, they say risk adverse is a priority. Climate change, never heard of it. Not a priority. So eradicating anything, mandating, or any kind of guidance that has not been codified into law related to climate change, which then opens the door for massive nuclear expansion and possibly also looking into congressional's requirement of declaration of war, and that shouldn't necessarily be limited to Congress, and is another power that is looking to be usurped directly into the executive office. The Department of Defense chapter specifically, what I wrote down was 4 priorities: command accountability, maximum effectiveness, border protection, and financial transparency. That's it. That's the only thing it's supposed to do. I don't know that I really knew what it was doing, but it wasn't any of those. Thoughts?
Well, the border protection, well, kind of when you read this, at least for the Department of Defense chapter, it's kind of like you have a narrative and then you insert phrases that don't follow the flow of it. So like when you say border protection, that becomes one of those terms where they don't really elaborate on that. They just kind of borders and then psh, they throw it off. And they don't talk about it as much. They allude to it with the drug war, at least from what I'm seeing in the Department of Defense stuff. Because that's one of the things that I was watching. And so they're walking a very fine line because I had a bigger expectation that there would be like, we're going to use the military like at our borders and everything else. But that isn't necessarily what I see in this. But it has that possibility. In terms of the power, going through and taking more powers for the president, that's absolutely there. The irony is that several times they're complaining about bureaucracy and clearing out these layers. But then right above, so we're going to clear this, clear this, clear this, and then oh, we're going to put one person up here who's an appointee, and that person
Mhm.
functions as a bottleneck, single-handedly responsible for what the priorities are, and that
Right.
they have a
But
few of those.
the bottleneck role of that person is particularly important to point out because the theme through the entire book is to replace civil servants with, quote, nonpartisan civil servants who are loyal to the president's agenda. That is not what the word nonpartisan means, but that's what they're doing. So they're getting rid of anyone in any government position that does not promote the current president's agenda and ascribes a high degree of loyalty. I'm a Slytherin. I'm all about this, but you also have the next president who might have a different agenda. So continuity, right? Like that's a weird thing. So not would not be my first choice, although I do loyalty is a very important thing to me. But the bottleneck is because each one of these departments and bureaucracies is just repeating the executive office's agenda. So there's no pushback up to the executive office, nor is there informing the president. So the dismantling of councils and things like this that are advising the cabinet to the president doesn't need advisement. The president has an agenda and it comes from high down, and everybody on top of other people are now a bottleneck of any new information coming up that could possibly shift the loyalty to the president's agenda.
Is there a contrary way to look at it and say that decisions are being made by experts in their field?
I would hope so. I mean, that would be amazing, except we overthrew the Chevron case. So we don't think there are experts more than the people who are in business. So we only cater to those businesses, and we're gutting any experience that would be happening inside those government offices. So yes, except we fired them all. And businesses don't need to listen to them anyway. So that's the bottleneck. So it's more like tapping it down and just feeding information down instead of letting anything go up.
Hmm.
Yay.
Can I
Okay.
ask you a question real quick? Earlier when you
Oh.
said risk adverse, what did you mean by that?
I don't know what they meant by that, but it was a theme that I'm assuming. I truly don't know, because to me it seemed very, very strange. But if you're going to build up a nuclear arsenal, but say you're being risk averse, I think it's some machismo thing that like you're reducing risk by being so outlandishly powerful.
So what's funny though is in the Department of Defense, so basically there's a lot where it's talking about clearing out the procurement process
Hmm.
and the contracts and not having 3 years of delay. And there's some agreement on that. Like the contract process and the bureaucracy does create a lot of hurdles. The issue is that you now have procurement that may be happening by a single individual in one location. But sorry, that was going back to the other thing. The risk adverse comes up because Department of Defense, it constantly is saying we shouldn't be afraid to take risks. In fact, just because something hasn't gone through this rigorous process of whatever, if it's a new technology and it has the benefit of helping us, we
Try it
shouldn't,
out.
yeah, we should try it out. And so,
Interesting.
because they're trying to fast lane smaller to medium sized businesses so that if they have an element of innovation, they can incorporate it faster. Um,
Yeah, no, I don't think that's wrong, and I don't actually think that that um, somehow stands out differently than the hypocrisy of the other chapters. Um, the emphasis on business and innovation with paired with deregulation, like more things are going to blow up because they didn't know you can't take them that fast or something, right? Like, but you're going to put it to market before you have to do tests because there's no regulations. I think that's another example of one of these loopy conversations. Um, I don't. Luckily, I didn't write it. I don't know. Um, okay,
well, no,
let's.
it almost sounds like a lot of like Musk type stuff where it's like, let's try it if it doesn't work. And it's like in the olden days in World War II, you'd have something called like skunk works with Lockheed and Boeing, where you'd have select individuals who could separate and they didn't have to go through the same process. And yeah, that had innovation associated with it. But
Hmm.
it goes back to that big contradiction you're saying about if we're relying on the market to develop these things on its own and it's not, then there's not the demand for it. And
Right.
so they're about to
Well,
create the
and
demand.
in the trade chapter, Boeing and General Electric are named specifically as problems, as if they are, quote, they've been treated like they're too big to fail, which they also do not like because it limits competition, although they take a lot of those funds too. Because competition hasn't been allowed to even try, because it's going to go to Boeing, it's going to go to General Electric, it's going to go to Lockheed. But to your point is, there's nothing stopping anything from trying. It just isn't enough demand or need. And if we're going to be looking at monopolies slash too big to fail, then there's already kind of a spectrum. And being sore losers that you didn't create a successful company that could take something out of Boeing's market share does not mean that you should be looking at this as throwing it all out and that this is no longer a free market economy. And the other side of your mouth, trying to build your own sense of monopolies or too big to fail organizations that would be funded by tax dollars. You can't do both, but it's another one of those circle things. There's lots of hypocrisy and circular logic, and being charitable, calling it circular logic.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, and that goes back to the thing where it's like, okay, we're kind of saying the same thing over and over again, and transgender people need to be kicked out of the military. It's like, oh wait, what? That one's there too. People who suffer from gender dysphoria. And so that's the language they use it, and you read, and then it's like things we need to do, and it's like kick out people with gender dysphoria.
Right.
And then after that it's like and no abortions. And that's the only mention of it. And so that's where it's almost like that sound bite of no. And it's like they went through and edited afterwards and they're kind of like, okay, let's keep adding these terms that are a calling card throughout it.
Yeah. Well, first, if I were to critique their writing process, the chapters don't talk to each other.
Mm-mm.
Um, they seem most at least use spell check. There's one chapter that definitely did not even use spell check. Certainly no one
That
edited the
hurts. That
final
hurts.
document. Oh, they didn't even use Grammarly. Like there are incomplete sentences that just for floating in a paragraph had nothing to do with it. But a commonality is it does seem that there's like a desk of post-it notes of grievances or keywords that just got shoved in like a piñata or something. That's a general characteristic of the writing style, which is painful as a writer. Um, okay, let's go into another block of text that it talks about, which is also weird language when you think about everything else in context. First off, we should collaborate with our partners and allies together, except we are throwing out all agreements of any ally or any long term responsibility to each other or to other countries because we don't care and we're taking our ball and going home. But it does say collaborate with partners or allies together, but only in a way that is actually benefiting the United States. We need to re examine the speed of relevance. Nuclear dominance, very important. And then it mentions again this less risk averse but increase of innovation loop de loop. Uh-huh. I I don't think you can do all of those and do everything else it says. But thank you for your thoughts.
Well, you know what? When I was reading it, the one thing I kept thinking to myself was, I can only control myself. I can only, you know how like you say when the world's overwhelming, it's like, I can only control my own actions. I can only control myself. And so this is a manifesto of how I'm going to control the actions of others, which, you know, it reads like the Monroe document, like from the early 1900s when we're talking about like we have to protect this and you have this national spent, but that was the biggest thing. I was like, I can only control what's around me. And this is
Right.
all of this is like we're gonna force them to do these things as our allies if they want to stay our allies. Well, we're the biggest threat to them. So like I don't know.
Right. We've kind of negotiated these relationships so that we are the biggest threat,
Mhm.
socially, possibly economically, and maybe even militaristically. Um, but I guess that's not enough or something. So the other, next box of notes I took, which you already talked a little bit about, like, oh shit, we have to talk about general gender dysphoria and get that in there somewhere. We're reiterating the COVID vaccine. People should be reinstated, even though a lot of people were able to get honorably discharged out of the military under the guise of not taking the vaccine. Um, Close all DEI because, of course, it's Marxist indoctrination,
Yeah.
end abortion funding. Um, Not really entirely sure what that has to do with sexual harassment or sexualized violence. Probably don't need any of that, would be my guess. I asked a question about IVF. Um, the just for fun, really, but not answered. And then it does also mention HIV positive folks or treatment. Get all them out. Just these things need to be talked about. The only people who come back in are the people who refuse to take a COVID vaccine to begin with. We have to divide and disband Homeland Security and the Coast Guard. Fix it, fix it. The Coast Guard has been kind of the redheaded stepchild through most of these chapters. I say that as a former natural redhead, not stepchild, but child. I didn't know the Coast Guard wasn't part of the Department of Defense. I don't know why I assumed that, but I did. But they are the catch-all in probably half of the chapters of like, I don't know, give it to the Coast Guard. I don't know how the Coast Guard would feel about that. Um, the treasury aspect needs to function like the World Bank or the IMF, um, but are also some of the first global organizations that the US has to immediately withdraw from, which I find fascinating because Antifa, which doesn't exist, but very progressive people have been protesting the World Bank and IMF for decades. And who knew? The Heritage Foundation agrees. Different reasons, but they want to withdraw because they don't want to be funding people's standard of living around the world anymore. Um, and they recommend financial warfare, which I kind of mentioned at the top, is that it's not all just like eyeballs and guns and drones and nuclear, but there's other ways of doing warfare too. Uh, Inside of the Department of Defense, you have your nuclear deterrence and missile defense. You have your Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. And then you have Space Force, Offense and Defense, Cyber Command, and Special Operations. Yep, that's my notes. I'm not gonna lie, I really actually had expectations about this chapter, which I don't know why. I should never have expectations about any of the chapters, but this one I was like, all right, let's do this. Go America. Remember that movie? America, fuck yeah. Like I really was expecting this like super patriotic something and did not deliver.
And that's an interesting point, is one of the biggest ways that you can defend spending on defense, and all of this document says, is increase spending, increase spending.
Mhm.
Um, One of the ways that you typically can do that is that you are like, America, like if you want to be patriotic, if you don't allow that, if you don't do this, like it's all on you, which this document really doesn't do. Honestly, kind of having read like policy documents before, if they leave out the stupid things where they randomly are like Biden, and you're like, okay, we didn't need that. And maybe you should fact check if we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years or a lot longer than that. Um,
Right.
and
Or
so,
that it was Trump that negotiated the bad departure out of Afghanistan to occur in Biden's early years. So Biden felt like he had to go through with it, and surprise, it didn't work well because you shouldn't negotiate with terrorists. Yeah, little facts like that could be helpful.
well, and if we look at most of our exit strategies, we haven't been that great since World War II. And even then, we ended up dividing Berlin. Like, it's it's not something that historically we've been good at. It's in terms of like emulating Reagan economics, it's nuclear war. I mean, it's even taking it back those to that time where it's like that's what the enemy is. China now, it's not Russia, but you're making that enemy, and so you want to build up the arms around it. And yeah, one thing though that I do want to point out though is
Yep.
some of the stuff makes sense. Like looking at the Marines, changing them from a larger unit and actually getting them back to some of their original aspects, because we have used the Marines in the past for a disproportionate amount of peacekeeping or
Hmm.
military activities. And so one of the things was talking about taking away the MIPs, military police, from the Marines, downsizing them, which would decrease some of their expenditures because they wouldn't need some of the tactical weapons. One thing that I do find very unrealistic though is a lot of their spending, they're like, we'll take from here, like we'll cut this out, and then we'll give this group that. Well, if you're eliminating things from the Marines that are historically old equipments, like the new equipments, the spending and the cost of those are enormous. Like
Right.
the research and development that has to go into it. This whole document ignores the fact of research and development. Like you can't make it just happen.
It
Um,
actually, in some of the chapters, not in this one, it actually specifies we don't need to do any research and development and we should cut those offices and then implement all these new things.
well, and here it talks about setting up a military academy that like builds up engineers. And so it's funny because they talk about the current military academies going through and getting rid of the Marxist ideology and DI. Um,
Liberals, what are we going to do with them?
which I don't think is a big part of the curriculum. Maybe there's a few trainings, but I never saw any classes for students when I was tutoring that on how to become a Marxist. Um, it just does, but then it talks about, eliminate tenure. But then the irony is over here, you want to make this type of research institution, partner with MIT or California Polytech. And it's those are things that help build that innovation in professors, like when you have an element of tenure because they have that stability and they're able to do it. And so you're taking away that research function, which you also are talking about making sure that we're doing more research. And that's one way that we do support it. Um,
Mhm.
Restore standards of lethality and excellence. So I just don't understand how removing HIV positive people from that or gender dysphoria. But then it raises the question of like, why no other health conditions? Do we
Right.
allow diabetics into the military? Do we?
Right.
And so,
I mean, the justification is a little more apparent in the executive order, so that it states that people who receive gender reassignment surgeries are heavily medicated for 12 months afterwards, therefore not combat ready, so they have to be removed. First off, that is just not true. And you have people who are giving birth, you have people who have cancer treatments, you have all different kinds of depression, anxiety who are medicated for much longer than 12 months. It doesn't make any sense. And the claims that they're actually making are not true. The HIV positive folks, the stereotype, of course, is that they are weak and ill and not able to be combat ready. So that's the lethal standards, is it's getting rid of a lot of willing, able people who are interested in serving in the military when we no longer can socially have a draft, but we're going to pick fights with people all around the planet.
oh yeah. And then we talk about like sovereignty, and then we just infringe on everybody else's sovereignty.
Right.
I mean, it's an entire bullet point: eliminate Marxist indoctrination
Uh-huh.
and divisive critical race theory. I mean, I'm not really sure what the Marxists anyway. And then
No,
there's
no,
comment
yeah,
like
nobody knows what it is. They certainly don't know what it is, but it's anything they don't like, basically. That's what rolls into equity related work, anything that I've thought of ever doing. They don't know what it is. But it's also important to point out that during George Bush 2.0, when they got rid of everything social justice related, it's same, where the work has been here. There are organizations that are doubling down on doing this work, while there are other people who weren't really into it to begin with and are very excited they don't have to do it anymore. Same. All
yeah.
right, what else you got note wise? Otherwise, I'm gonna read the points in the Stop the Coup 2025 document.
Um, there was one thing where they actively are talking about sorry, there was the biggest thing though is it's like you're getting it's limiting, hold on.
I've met you. I know that there's something going on.
Oh, you know what impacts combat readiness for women?
Mm,
Pregnancy. So if they
mm.
want accessibility to an abortion to stay combat ready, I think that should be their patriotic choice, shouldn't it?
Except that women shouldn't be in combat. Remember,
I see.
and they need to stay home with the children anyway because the breadwinner is gonna conceive them children's.
Well, but they actually, one thing they do talk about, which is true. Um, oh, they're talking about the draft numbers. So stop using the army as a test bed for social evolution. Um, the army no longer reflects national demographics to the degree that it did before 1974 when the draft was eliminated. I don't think the disproportionate demographics, which are overwhelmingly non-Caucasian, um, I don't think that's because of social evolution. In fact, anyway. And so like our service members are overwhelmingly minority because we take advantage of those who may not have as many opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the argument is, yes, you are possibly creating opportunities, but there is that effort that's clearly in this document about increasing our military numbers because they
Mm-hmm.
want increased military readiness. And so they mentioned the recruitment goals, um, but then increasing to high schools and making sure that if a location receives federal funding, that they have access to it and JRTC has access to it, and also even having students take the military readiness aptitude test. Why? Like that's a waste. Could you imagine how much money goes into testing all high school students for a purpose that really isn't listed there? Um,
Also, they don't want their high school students recruited. It's somebody else's. students recruited, but they don't want them to all be marginalized populations because then that's really awkward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's called racism. That's what that is. That's picking and choosing and possibly classism to not have to expect your own children to do it. Anyway,
Yeah, but
I
that's even in 1974, we didn't necessarily reflect the demographics because the white people drafted were going to college. Like
mhm,
by the end of the Vietnam War, our numbers were overwhelmingly Black, African American, and
right.
minorities. Um,
Yeah, or they had bone spurs if they weren't going to college. Um, all right,
oh,
so
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Sorry.
You
Oh, I
you
was,
get one more, and then we'll go do this list.
I'm not saying I'm saying in general, it's important is that they do mention the element of military personnel's partners. And in your case, the perspective is, hey, if we can, maybe get people jobs, they'd want to hang out more. But I've heard actually from my friends who are married to service members, it's a matter of getting a job in another country.
Right.
Um, and the reality is that we place a huge burden on the family members in military service. Like we save so much money because we don't rehab our military service members, we don't provide them with the mental health supports that they need. All of this is falling on the caregivers, and it does not provide an absolute solution for that, but at least mentions it, which I do think is important to at least
Yeah,
highlight.
this is what I mean by like the little glimmers of hope is that they're hard to find in a poorly written, awful document, but recognizing that families matter and that they're carrying a lot of the burden, um, similar to COVID, where people transition to working from home, our home electrical grids are now feeding our internet and our electricity instead of the big office buildings, the big high rises. Part of the reason that there is a huge mandate to go back to work, right, is that these buildings, the real estate property value is pointless if they're not being used. They're just sat empty. But understanding the infrastructure of who actually supports the military, um, it was nice to see, like, oh, right, that those are people and families who are having to care and deal with split families because you can't find a job in a particular location. And that's even without being deployed. It was nice. It was nice. Just one little post-it note got stuck in there. Okay, Stop the Coup 2025 says key points. I'm gonna just read all these until your head explodes and you need to say something. So feel free to interrupt. Refocus on Department of Defense on war fighting, chain of command accountability. Adopt irregular warfare. Those of you doing dishes, there's air quotes around irregular warfare as a cornerstone of U.S. military strategy abroad. This is using finances and trade and other things. Design a system to purchase new or experimental weapon systems without breaking the law. Don't break the law, but avoiding DoD regulatory red tape. Boost U.S. military sales. Don't break the law, but see if you can like squirrel around it. Increase Department of Defense support for Department of Homeland Security for domestic border security. Limit China and its nuclear military capability by supporting a Taiwan, air quotes, denial defense, air quotes, and a major step reverse the historic U.S. policy of deterrence only to invest and adopt an offensive missile defense policy and space defense policy. That's a big one, it seems. Okay. Okay, support allies to engage in and shoulder the burden of conventional warfare. Enact a radical transformation of the Marine Corps Force Design 2030, which Colleen, you talked about. Expel individuals with gender dysphoria, that's air quotes as well. Transgender is in parentheses. Cut public funding for transgender surgery or to facilitate abortion for service members. Counter DoD diversity initiatives. Eliminate, quote, Marxist indoctrination and divisive critical race theory programs, unquote, and diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI offices and staff. Monitor military schools to remove, quote, Marxist indoctrination, unquote. Eliminate tenure for leftist scholars. You already talked about that. And invest in U.S. cybercom. Dun, dun, dun. That is pretty much not really what I thought this chapter was going to be about. I don't know if Department of Defense needs like a better marketing team, but that wasn't what I was thinking. So if that is what is being talked about, then I'm curious, what can we do as regular normal people, right? So like one of the first things I would think of is I live in this teeny tiny town. You actually live in an urban city. I'm curious if there are military family support groups or services that are in our local towns. Um, if there's something here in my teeny tiny town that I can do to support people who may have family members who are deployed and or family members who have come back, what services are available or not. I have no idea what is available. That's one of the first things that kind of popped into my brain. Second one is around recruiting centers. I know we have a recruiting center in the mall. It is right next to the arcade, which I think could be on purpose. Um, but those are the first two things I thought of, is like knowing where these things are and where they exist. Also, do you live near a National Guard? Where are they working and living, and when they get called in for either, I guess they probably don't call it practice, but when they get called in for duty, um, is it anywhere near you? That might be a good question. What are your thoughts of things people could do in their hometowns or at their dinner tables?
I think if there is an element to try and ramp up production or manufacturing, like it's a longer term thing. So we'll see prices increase if we're putting a lot of tariffs on. Um, and so it's weird to think about tariffs like there's a cause and effect, there's a domino associated with these things. And that's about, hey, over here, we may be pissing off the rest of the world. They're raising their tariffs on us. And so what is the cost going up? I have a feeling China's taken that tactic against us, actually. And so
Mm-hmm.
we need to recognize that when these things are happening, they're all interconnected with the choices that our government is making to be a dick abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of more of a meta thing, but sometimes having conversations with like we're very much like an eye-focused US sovereignty. And even if you wanted to be very nationalistic, so a lot of us are about like the US first. In this case, we're actually not putting the US first. I mean, the argument is that we are by getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but we're not in that if we were putting the US first, we just focus on us. Like, so we're looking out so many different places. I guess those aren't
Mm-hmm.
really action steps, but for me as a teacher, I know the recruiting piece is something that stood out to me. And I know that, pay attention. Are the recruiters going to schools that are in your lower income areas? If you do have, JR2, if you're getting recruiters in your area, find out where they're going. That should be accessible. Like you should know who's in your school. And I'm not saying it's
Mm-hmm.
bad to have recruiters in your school. I'm saying though it's bad to have them putting pressure on a certain population, not others, and not giving that opportunity to as many people for, you know, to sign up for the military, I guess. That's one way to
Yeah,
look at
it might not be bad to have them in your schools, but it does seem strange if, I mean, I don't have children in schools, but if I had children in schools and I didn't know that there were military recruiters in school, I think I would want to know that. And interestingly, Department of Education, I just recorded that last week. It's already up on the playlist. We talk a lot about parents' rights and that this is a big push, right? From primarily the Protestant Christian place of like needing to know everything that is happening in your school. Yeah, if that was the case, then homeschool. Like, if you need to know all this stuff, you do not need to be micromanaging teachers. But on that note, if you're going to, I would like to know if there's military recruiters at the school, right? Like that's a great example. Um,
Yeah. And also something else they're talking about is like decertifying professions even in the Department of Defense. Like lowering the benchmarks and the standards for those things. And I think it's okay to ask people like, what are your qualifications? And,
mhm.
are they gaslighting you? Is this someone that we're afraid to ask for legitimacy? And that's horrifying. That's a huge thing, actually, is the
Yeah.
legitimacy aspect. And I think that that's a piece of it. And then at the local level, I know a lot in the past. I mean, it really is that grassroots political activism, but this one is touchy because if we get in a conflict, it becomes very hard to say anything against military policies. And
Mhm.
so you have to ask yourself, am I willing to put myself out there to oppose this when, let's say, there is action against the United States? Does it still make these behaviors okay? Probably not for some of it. And so that's a big thing you have to watch out for as well,
Well, and
is
maybe
the
maybe
pushback.
we also need to be having conversations of what are we okay with and what are we not okay with.
Yes.
Um, that I know when I was telling the story the other day, but I took a concealed carry gun class because I was asked to co-facilitate a gun law access discussion group here in my town, and the person who asked me to co-facilitate it with them, lovely human being, but very obviously all guns should be confiscated and like turned into bookshelves or something like that. So I knew that somebody needed to show up understanding more about California gun laws and what was happening, and my co-facilitator's not going to do that. So I took the class. And at the end of the class, I really enjoyed the class. I really learned a lot. Growing up in Texas, I was far more familiar with hunting rifles than handguns. California is a totally different state. It was amazing. I really am glad I took it, learned a ton. At second day of the class, you go to a shooting range, you get to shoot everything. Um, the instructor asked me if I wanted to fire an AR-15, and I was like, "What's the point of taking this class if I don't get to do that?" So I did that. And at the end, you're supposed to state, like, okay, well, if you were to buy a gun, because obviously they're selling guns, right? If you were to buy a gun, which gun would you want and why? And you can now make an educated guess. And so I said a single hand operated musket. And they were like, "What? Why would you want that?" And I said, "Because if I was ever actually going to use the gun, I would prefer to have about 25 minutes to really think through my decision. And then upon actually deciding, yes, I am actually going to do this, I would also like to be close enough to the person that I could see what I was doing."
I hear you.
Yeah. But I didn't know how important distance was, or like reflective thought, and people in the class were like, "You're going to get shot." And I was like, I am more comfortable getting shot than I am actually shooting somebody else. That's something I need to know about myself. I'm not saying everybody else needs to feel the way that I do, but if we're talking about what these standards are, what regulations are, what do we want US warfare to be looking like if it's offensive versus defensive? I think that this is at least at minimum a conversation you could have over dinner at the table one day with your family.
Oh yeah.
Like,
And it's especially too, like, where they're saying like, hey, we need to not, like, we don't need all this testing. Like, bureaucracy gets in the way. Bureaucracy gets in the way. And we need to be okay with things that may not be finished. We're forgetting the most important piece that puts at risk our soldiers.
right.
Like,
Who are actively serving while we're intellectually bantering. Right.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the thing where I'm just like, okay, so, you know, we're putting at risk this population and you're wondering about your recruitment numbers. I think it's when people have opportunities and they may, especially in times of war, like recruitment numbers tend to go down during times of conflict because, well, I take that back. I don't have the numbers in front of me. But there's a big difference between like recruiting because it's your, or going because it's your patriotic duty versus, I need something to do after high school. And that's what we're doing. So,
Right. Okay, I have one more question for you just because you're you, and I did not warn you about this, but while we were talking, I realized, oh, you should totally ask Colleen this question while I can't. Hey, Colleen! Question. Uh, you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, and Manifest Destiny was mentioned in the inauguration speech. Um, do you want to just tell the three people who should be putting their laundry away, but instead they're watching this video? Um, what are those things, and what is the order? What do they have to do with each other? What's going on?
well, I feel like because I'm social studies certified, I don't teach US history, and this came up the other day for my students. And so if they come across this, I don't want them to be like, Miss Schmidt doesn't know the dates of the Monroe Doctrine and all of it specifies. Hold on.
For the
Because,
record, I don't know the dates at all,
well,
and You're
I
about
want
to
to.
hand my ass to me, which is fantastic. So do it.
Okay. So I was worried about like confusing the Monroe document with the Roosevelt Quarterly, and I can't pronounce things. I'm sorry about that. Monroe
Okay.
document is basically our president saying in the 1800s, 1823. So we're a relatively young country. So this is after the War of 1812, where we got our ass kicked, um, in quite a few areas. But it says, leave us alone. We are responsible for anything that is in our hemisphere. And so by issuing the statement, it gave us the authority, air quotes, authority. We gave ourselves the authority to go anywhere in our hemisphere and do what we needed to do to protect our sovereignty. I mean, this is how we get our,
I love when we can give ourselves the authority.
I know. Well, and it's like a lot of the stuff that they're talking about in this Department of Defense, they intentionally say we need to protect, North and South America, which is exactly the same as Monroe document. This is also the policy that got us involved in Latin and South America, where we were having banana republics and, all the CIA, overthrows or supports of different dictatorships. That was all done in the defense of US sovereignty because these pose threats to us. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
that issue again. Manifest destiny is the idea that the United States, God has graciously bestowed upon our country uh, the east to the west coast, and so we should head westward because once we were able to get past kind of the Appalachian, like the Appalachian Mountains, we're like, hell yeah, this is all ours. The Native Americans had a few comments on that, but by saying manifest destiny, it's one of those things that kind of encourage the U.S. citizens to, go west, which,
Go west.
yeah, again, ignoring all those people who already live there, aka the Native Americans.
We have given ourselves the authority that we're supposed to do this. And we then justified it by saying that God told us to do it.
Dude, remember, we're the same country that made an international organization and they were like, no thanks, and peace out on the League of Nations. Like, it's our norm
Yeah,
where we
it's what
say
we
that.
do.
It
It's totally
is.
what we do. Um, I thought I have another question. Because we got our ass handed to ourselves in 1812, predictions. Are we as a country and as at least the current today, January 28th definition of democracy with a big, a little d, not democratic, but democracy, are we going to survive the ass kicking that is about to occur?
I mean, I guess I hate to say it to be proven wrong. I mean, but the world would end if I'm proven wrong. But I I see some cycles of history. Like at the turn of the
Mm-hmm.
century, we were horribly anti-immigrant. We can go through and find, the advertisements, the same rhetoric about the immigrants, how they're stealing our jobs, except in that case, it's the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Um, oh, hey, you know what? China comes up again. We become very nationalistic, where we're very pro being U.S., and then, we go into World War One, and part of that was that element of nationalism. But
Mm-hmm.
we could stay clear of that if we wanted to, because we're a country that's only bordered by these two other countries. Like, we're not Europe. We're not in the Balkans
Right.
where we have like 60 groups around us who all want their own country. And so I think we could make it through because some of the shit's the same stuff we've done before.
I honestly say I completely agree. And as a U.S. history teacher who is not nearly as well read as you are, but history does repeat itself because we refuse to learn the lessons. And I was on a podcast earlier today, and I was talking about how, to me, one of the most important things about a functional democracy is dissent and questions. And this is this is a descent to the pendulum swing of Obama, right? So yes, progressive people, we were critical of Obama, right? Because he became so moderate and also did not get assassinated and was able to do like really progressive or at least liberal things. So this is the pendulum swing to that. And it is intellectually compelling that we have gotten this conservative as a reminder of this is how like liberal and progressive that felt to other people.
Mhm.
You know, like anti-abortion folks have waited 50 years, right? And so then us pinko commie Marxist liberals, whatever they're calling us, you know, can we stay organized as an organized minority voice for the next 50 years? That's the dare here. And if we can, then our country survives for 50 more years. And if we can't, that's on us. And if the descending pendulum is landed us here, then maybe there are things that could grow and benefit from the scrupulous examination or Drano being poured down, right? There's something positive, I believe, that can come out of this. I also know that not everybody survived the first Trump administration, and people are not going to survive this Trump administration. So it's very easy for me to say that because I likely will survive this Trump administration, but I also believe the country will. And I don't know that everybody is on that page to understand like this is how dissent works. It will
Yes.
cost people lives, and this is how dissent works.
Yeah, and I don't think, people today in a weird way don't know how to organize, and they don't know how to protest, and they don't know, we don't have those skills like we used to in some
Mm-hmm.
ways. Like I'll send my hopes and prayers, or I'll sign a e-petition, which is great. We love that communication, but there is some volume to being, in their face and following up and going to different things. And I think
Wouldn't it be
oh, go ahead.
the power of having those conversations at your dining room table is figuring out what is it that you do believe in.
Yeah.
And if once you reconnect to your own belief systems, it's pretty hard to rattle them. You can change your mind, but you often will change your mind because it's more in alignment with your belief system when you have new information.
Yes.
Preach, Jessica, preach. Colleen, thank you very much for spending too much time with me and talking about the Department of Defense.
No problem. Sorry if I took you on a little long.
No, this is fantastic. I really appreciate it. So I'm gonna wave and say goodbye.
Bye. Have a good one, yo.